Nikki! Hello! Everybody has something compelling to say. They just need to figure out the best way to say it.
Long story, but...
Long story, but?
Wait, I'm saying it's a long story? Okay, here we go.
Long story, but...
Long story, no. That's a good question.
It's a long story, but...
Oh, long story, but...
Is the long story, but...
Long story, but...
Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to chat with one of my dearest friends, Emily.
My name is Emily Knott. I am a mental health clinician working out of Eugene, Oregon. I am a trauma therapist by trade and training who has a background in folklore and neurofeedback. Long story, but I never thought I would be a mental health counselor.
A quick note about this episode. As you know by now, I call my friends to chat with them. And in this interview, our call dropped about halfway through. Though it was for the better. The first few minutes of audio are a bit rough, but it clears up after that. So how did Emily end up in a field she never thought she'd be in?
I figured that I would either end up sort of an international nomad moving from job to job, season to season, maybe even writing the next great American novel, or I would end up in some obscure corner of academia and ultimately work in a museum or a national park or a nonprofit or something like that. I got about halfway done with both of those, spent the better part of my time in undergrad country hopping through different study away programs, and then I landed in Washington, D.C. at the Symphony Museum for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, and realized that I loved people and their diversity of expression. So I went to school for folklore, which is an obscure corner of academia. And I might be shunned from the official folklore club for saying it, but, it is what it is. And both of those paths would have led me to, being either an international nomad or working in an obscure corner of academia. My second year of graduate school, something changed. While I was doing my field work with pagans in the U.S. military, I discovered that I really liked narrative. I liked listening to how people position themselves and the worlds that they create through their narratives. And I realized that I wanted to do more than just record and analyze them later. I wanted to connect with, the people that were sitting in front of me on a deeper level. I wanted to reflect their narratives back to them so that they could hear the amazingness that was happening, to what it was to be human in their world. Humanness I was hearing. So I went to school for counseling, and now I'm a trauma therapist.
Much of what the public sees in terms of mental health counseling is often portrayed by a cliché Freudian psychologist. Sitting in a long chaise lounge, being asked about the relationship you have with your mother, your father, how happy your childhood was. This idea carries with it a sense of discomfort, being studied by a total stranger. But there's a lot being done in modern media to dismantle both the cliché of therapy, but even more to destigmatize mental health. Everyone has something that they struggle with. Some of our quote-unquote demons might be bigger than others, and some trauma may affect our lives in different ways. But everyone has something or things that they need to work through. It's simply a consequence of life. And there are so many different means of seeking help. Counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, shrinks, therapists, head docs. There are so many names and nuances to the field of mental health. It can be confusing and overwhelming. So let's start where we can, with Emily, a mental health counselor. What does a mental health counselor do?
My modality in trauma therapy is eclectic. So I take all of my training, both from school and all of the training that I do, I've done outside of my program. I take my life experience, as a human and as a counselor, and I apply it to whoever is sitting in front of me. Because I don't believe that there is one theory or practice or modality that fits every person and every narrative. So it's like counseling made for whoever is in front of me. So if somebody comes to me and they say, man, I really don't like journaling, I'm not going to have them journal outside of counseling. Somebody comes to me and they say, hey, I don't want to talk. I just need the bad dreams to go away. I'm going to say, hey, why don't you think about neurofeedback? And that way we don't have to do the talk part of the trauma work. So what that looks like is that I have a private practice in Eugene, Oregon, where I see clients, and those clients will either do unique, specified, tailored to them talk therapy with me, or they will do neurofeedback with me, or sometimes they will do both, depending on what their end goals are and what their history and narrative is.
Can you describe a little bit what neurofeedback is and how that works?
I mean, you could describe it as relatively new because it hasn't been as around as long as something like psychodynamic theory and Freud and whatnot, but it's been around for many decades now. And neurofeedback is a way of retraining the brain, rewiring the brain, helping the brain really become the best version of itself. So the thing to know about the brain is that it is an information mega processing machine. It wants to learn. So in neurofeedback, what we do is we put electrodes on someone's head, and those electrodes are never sending electricity into the brain at any point. This is not electroshock therapy. The electrodes are reading the brain waves, typing them down the wires, and then showing them back to the client through a secondary computer screen. So as the client is watching whatever is on the computer, the brain is seeing what it's actually doing. And if the brain sees what it's doing, it realizes that it is dysfunctional. And it goes, oh, wait, we don't want to do that. Let's fix it. It is wild. I've been working with neurofeedback for 2-3 years now, and it amazes me. It always amazes me with what it can do. I've seen people with chronic acute PTSD suddenly be able to sleep again. I've seen people with major depressive disorder be able to come off their medications because their nervous system re-regulates. I've seen it give people their lives back, and it's absolutely incredible.
So this all hinges on trauma. What is it, and how does it affect people?
In a nutshell, the way I describe trauma is any time in your life where you have felt helpless and unable to escape the helplessness.
When people hear trauma, they think about particularly intense trauma, right? If something really catastrophic happened to you, I'm just going to use this example of 9/11 because I'm realizing as the older I get, the more it affected me. As a child, when 9/11 happened, I thought it was traumatic to the people that were in the building and the people who had family and friends in the building. And I felt immense emotional reaction to it. As a 4th or 5th grader, I couldn't accept that experience could be traumatic to me because I saw it as myself being distanced from it, right? And there's a lot of things that I think happen on a daily basis that people are affected by and either like trigger previous trauma or things that are traumatic in ways that maybe people don't feel like they have the right or the space to acknowledge they're traumatized by.
In the field of trauma counseling, we understand that there are different types of trauma, and we define those by big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T trauma, a great example is 9/11. It's something big, it's something catastrophic, it's something that hopefully people only go through once, twice, a few times in their lifetime. The exception to that, of course, is if you are a first responder or in the military or work in a very high stress job. You may experience more big T trauma than the average American. The second type of trauma is what we call little t trauma. And that while this is a lower intensity of trauma, it is generally more prolonged over time. So a great example of this is maybe childhood neglect, where like a single mom is working, trying to provide for her kids. But because she is working, kids are pretty much raising themselves. By definition, you could classify that as neglect, and it would be potentially traumatic for the child, even though it is born out of an innocence. But it would still have a profound impact on the kid and how they attach and attune to other people.
Can you just give other examples of lowercase t trauma? Are there other frequently cited or very common examples of lowercase t trauma that people might not recognize are things that were traumatic to them?
It's really, anything that we would classify as trauma that impacts your ability to handle stress and you don't have that resilient bounce back factor to. A parent leaving either through abandonment or passing, living with somebody who has chronic pain can be a little T trauma. So these are non-life-threatening injuries. So, you were in a car accident and maybe you have nerve damage. That's little T trauma. The death of a pet can be little T trauma, especially if you're really, really tied to that pet. Bullying or harassment, loss of a significant relationship. Growing up in a household where there was shouting. I love when somebody comes into my office and say, for example, this person identifies very strongly with an Italian American heritage. And they're like, oh, my parents were always really passionate. We're Italian American. They fought all the time. And sometimes a plate would be thrown, but we're just really passionate, fiery people. It's our Italian roots. Certainly not going to invalidate that to the client. It is worth noting that our nervous systems don't understand the difference between passionate, fiery parents and unsafety and distress.
Because our brain will process it the same despite the context maybe being different.
Exactly. And if you follow that person through their lifespan, they're in my office because they're having difficulties communicating with their partner because their nervous system is trying to reenact what it knows, that passion, that fire. And the partner is going, whoa, that's not how we communicate. When I say trauma responses, I mean classic trauma responses, dissociation, derealization, trouble sleeping, nightmares, etc. But I also mean things like self-harm, cutting, cigarette burns. I mean things like substance abuse and substance abuse of any substance. I mean things like eating disorders, binging, purging, restricting, orthorexia, obsession with healthy foods only. Things like obsessive compulsive symptoms can also be trauma responses. So trauma responses are wide and varying.
So what are some examples of success stories? How do neurofeedback and talk therapy help people?
What I'm going to do to preserve the confidentiality of my clients is take several narratives and put them in a hat and mix them all up and sort of combine them so that it's not recognizable. The first example for neurofeedback is a client presented with PTSD, couldn't sleep, nightmares, dissociation, with slight agoraphobia, not wanting to go outside, and some what could be described as OCD tendencies, always with the hand sanitizer, very ritualized hand washing, ritualized going through doors. And the precipitating event was that this person was a survivor of the Las Vegas shooting. Unfortunately, was left that experience with some really, really deep trauma imprint and did not want to talk about what happened in Las Vegas for very obvious reasons, but wanted to address the post-traumatic symptoms, the phobia, as well as the possible OCD symptoms through neurofeedback. And we can do all of that at the same time, generally using the same 4 to 5 placements. And then over the course of a month, she began to experience reduction in symptoms. Within 6 months, her symptoms she was reporting were completely alleviated. And then though she left and those effects were permanent, those gains were permanent, and I have not seen her or heard from her since. And at the end of the day, that's the goal. So for talk therapy, college-age female presenting with sexual trauma due to being on a very rapey campus. It's not a very official term, but when you work with sexual trauma predominantly, you tend to start thinking of certain places as like hotspots. So I, again, was presenting with, not wanting to go outside, trouble sleeping, a deep-seated fear of running into this individual on campus once she had to go back. We'll say that this campus was not in Oregon. And through the course of talk therapy, we were able to calm the bodily panic responses that she was having, calm the the fight or flight, the adrenaline in the chest, the hyperventilation, or the extreme fear freeze response, where in session she would almost become catatonic, and ultimately get her to a point where she was able to put into words what was happening for her and then work through it from there. And again, I have not seen this individual or heard from them since they essentially fired me, which is great. Like, all counselors and therapists want to be fired, because that means that they no longer need us.
So our new normal, COVID-19, what can we do as individuals to kind of process the trauma of stay-at-home orders and the constant barrage of news about death and being sick and all of the healthcare warnings about flattening the curve and wearing gloves and wearing masks and all of the things that we're constantly confronted with on a daily basis that are also constantly changing, so there's not a lot of time to process or accept things? Obviously, anyone listening to this knows what COVID-19 is and knows what these things are, but how can people do something for themselves to process what I would, based on what you just said, a big T trauma like COVID-19?
Point one, because this is multi-point answer here. Point one is that secondary trauma is real and it is valid. And what I mean by secondary trauma is exactly what you were describing in your 9/11 example, where the big T trauma did not happen to you. You weren't in New York. You weren't in the tower. You didn't have a family member hypothetically in the tower. Forgive me if you did, but you still experienced the impact of that big T trauma. COVID is another example of this, where, perhaps you don't know anyone yet with COVID, or you haven't lost anyone yet to COVID, but you are still experiencing the impact of COVID. So understanding that what you are feeling, the secondary trauma you are experiencing, is valid, and it is okay to be in your feelings. And it's okay to have feelings about it. And just practicing that self-compassion and that self-kindness. Second point is maintain as much of your routines as possible. One of the most fascinating things that I know about trauma is that, so for example, if someone is being attacked, you're walking down the street, you're being mugged. If you can remember to wiggle a finger while it's happening and keep your brain and your body, you can actually circumvent some of the effects of post-traumatic or acute stress. Wild, I know, but it's totally a thing. So the equivalent to doing that in COVID is maintaining as many of your routines as possible. So what that looks like for me is I still get up around the same time. I still try and move my body in an intentional way. I walk into my home office and I still see my clients via telehealth. I still cook dinner. I still put on jeans, as much as I would love to live in leggings. And I'm retaining as much of that everyday life as possible.
Why is it that intentionally moving a part of your body or wiggling a finger when something traumatic is happening, why does that mitigate or help to balance out potential post-traumatic stress? What is it about that makes that work?
I don't know the exact brain science behind it, but essentially the idea is when we go through trauma, it creates a divide between the mind and the brain and the body. And by wiggling a finger or going through your routines, you're keeping your brain and your body together. That's why when you see someone with perhaps what we would consider a classic case of post-traumatic stress disorder, I think any sort of veteran that's portrayed in popular media, they disassociate, they have bad dreams, there might even be hallucinations present, because the brain and the body are not working as one. Well, I think instantly of phantom limb syndrome, where somebody loses a limb, but they still have extreme pain. They still have extreme psychosomatic pain in that limb, and they feel like that limb is still there, and how that most of the time can be cured by holding up a mirror so that the brain sees oh, I have two legs. It tricks the brain into remembering that the brain and the body are one.
So it's almost like instead of showing the brain what it's doing during neurofeedback, you kind of just use a mirror to create that neurofeedback.
Yeah, yep, you got it. It's literally the same concept of showing the brain to itself.
So you're practicing telehealth. What does that look like? And how does that change things?
I am not practicing neurofeedback at all right now during the stay-at-home orders. Neurofeedback is not a modality that can be done through distance, which is really unfortunate because many people that come to me for neurofeedback are coming to me because they don't want to talk about what's happening for them, or they have tried talk therapy and they just feel like it's not effective for them. They are taking a pause in their neurofeedback treatment. And unfortunately, what I am seeing, part of the trauma of COVID-19 for them is that they are decompensating. Their nervous system is slowly becoming dysregulated again, and those symptoms are reemerging because they're not at the point in their neurofeedback where the gains, the positives are permanent. I really feel for them, and I hope we're back in office soon. The second part of that is in my talk therapy, I do try and implement somatic elements into talk therapy, somatic being grounded in the body. For example, if somebody is sitting on my couch and I notice like that their position on the couch has changed, maybe their leg bouncing and it's going a mile a minute, or maybe I see a flush creep up their neck, some sort of bodily reaction to what's happening, I can normally look at the client and I'm like, so what's happening in your body right now? What are you feeling in your body right now? Where's the tension? Where's the heat? And that can really give insight both into the trauma and the emotional state. And it is much, much harder to do that in telehealth because I'm really only seeing the person from maybe the chest up. So we are adapting as much as we can. And I use we here in the context of both clinician and client. And we're trying to find new strategies to be just as effective through the computer without such a heavy somatic element.
Another thing is, I'm sure there are people who perhaps can no longer afford to be able to see a counselor or a therapist. And I'm sure there's people, I know that you always say that everyone should see a therapist. So, everyone needs to go to therapy. So what's the best means of recognizing something that's maybe traumatic to you when you don't have a therapist or you don't have access to a therapist? And what can you do as an individual, especially now when you're stuck at home and you can't go meet new therapists and find the right person for you? What can you do to recognize and then try to overcome your own personal trauma?
My Richter scale, so to speak, for when is it time to go see a counselor or a therapist is asking, is this having a negative impact in my life? And the this in that context is whatever it is. Is the depression having a negative impact in my life? Are the trauma responses having a negative impact in my life? You can literally insert anything in there and ask, is this having a negative impact in my life? If the answer is no, probably, okay, and put okay in air quotes. Because, you're right. I do think everyone should see a counselor or a therapist at some point in their life, if only to deepen their relationship with themselves. If the answer is yes, this is having a negative impact in my life, then it is probably time to seek out a counselor or a therapist. There are a few things in terms of what you can do. You can contact therapists or counselors. Many of us, myself included, offer sliding scales for those that are in financially tricky situations. I remember very recently times in my life where $20 was a lot of money. There's no way that I could have seen a counselor or a therapist. So many of us offer sliding scales. Some of us do pro bono work, although honestly, that's fewer and far in between. But if you are truly stuck at home and don't have access to therapists doing low cost or no fee work, or even like a graduate school that has a therapy program that you can go to for free, anything that connects the mind and the body is going to be fantastic. So I know, people roll their eyes at meditation, but meditation can truly bring mind and body and spirit into alignment. Same for yoga, going for walks in nature, anything that puts you in your body, connects you with your body, and calms everything down.
So why is all of this important? We seem to be doing just fine every day, right? How is trauma relevant to every person?
Trauma is always relevant because none of us escape it. There's no person alive, at least that I have met or that I know about, that has not experienced some sort of trauma in their life. We kind of live in simultaneously a really good age for mental health and a really bad age for mental health. Trauma has become much more to the forefront of the American consciousness. And it's brought up a lot of good topics and conversations around trauma. So it's becoming more normalized, which is fantastic. But at the same time, we live, maybe I will also be shunned for this, but we live in the age of trigger warnings. And I will preface what I'm going to say by saying that I truly believe in trigger warnings. I think that they are very valuable. And that, for people that have big reactions to certain things, and certainly, I work with trauma survivors, so that I know that, they are important. But we live in an age where trigger warnings are overused, and it has become part of the cultural vernacular to say, oh, don't do that, I'm triggered. Don't say that, I'm triggered. And it minimizes, it almost takes value away from what this word triggered and trauma actually mean.
So you mentioned earlier that people like first responders or anyone in the military, people who have higher rates of experiencing trauma. What about therapists and counselors and psychologists? How do you manage the trauma that you're constantly engaging with while you're treating your patients or helping your patients cope with their trauma?
I work with veterans, I work with first responders, I work with survivors of sexual trauma, and most recently, I work with individuals experiencing the fallout from COVID. And I feel like mental health professionals are the invisible first responders. We hold so much for so many people. I like to call myself like the professional keeper of secrets. And I joke when I say it, and I normally smile when I say it, but I am a professional keeper of secrets, and that gets really, really heavy sometimes. I would be lying if I said that it didn't. Many of us have therapists. There are therapists for therapists. And, we really have to make a priority of setting and maintaining our boundaries and taking care of ourselves. Maybe someday someone out there will form a mental health professional support group the same way that they have first responder support groups or veteran support groups or, whatever the case may be. But professionally, myself and all of us are exposed to secondary trauma all day, every day when we're at work. And we have to make ourselves a priority when we think about healing and moving forward. It can sometimes be a lot, but you have to learn very quickly to not separate or segment yourself, because I don't feel like that's healthy, but to learn how to be present and be a therapist and be there for the client, and then leave the office and go home and be a partner, be a spouse, be a parent, be a dog mom, be whoever it is that you are outside the four walls of the therapy room. That can sometimes be a really challenging dynamic.
So why do it?
Because I know, and here's the thing that keeps me going even on the toughest days, I know that if I can leave the office having connected positively with someone, then I have made a positive impact in that person's life. At the end of the day, humans are relational creatures, mirror neurons, co-learning, attachment theory. It's all people to people to people to people. And if I can make a positive impact by just looking at someone and saying, I see you, I hear you, you are human, I am human, we're going to sit here and just be human together. Like, it gives me chills just thinking about it.
Now more than ever, being active or proactive about our mental health is critical. We're constantly inundated with information, for better or worse. Coping with our changing world and the challenges of a media-filled global population is tough, but there are resources and opportunities to learn better ways to cope with and overcome these challenges. Everyone experiences trauma at some point, and we all struggle with different things in our lives. Allowing yourself to be open to a better understanding of your own unique situation, reactions, and strengths is nothing but a positive opportunity for growth.
I am a trauma specialist. I take a lot of pride in the fact that I am a trauma specialist. But even if you don't feel like the trauma in your life is having a negative impact, go to counseling just to learn more about yourself, to deepen your relationship with yourself, to build your mental health and emotional reservoirs.
Thank you for listening. I appreciate your support on this new project. I love to hear from y'all, so reach out on social media or email me at longstorypod@gmail.com. This podcast should be available on the listening platform of your choice, and if it isn't, let me know. Head over to that platform, rate, review, and subscribe, because it really does help. And don't forget to check the show notes for resources and other links from Emily. Again, I'm truly grateful for your support. Until next time.
You should end with your tagline. There's always counseling for that. But it's so true.